Hello there. Look at you all couched up on the sofa. Watching a bit of telly, are you? Cuppa in your hand. Let's have a little chat about brains. The mightiest machine ever discovered. Right now, you have around 100 billion nerve cells in there. The same amount as there are stars in our galaxy, with trillions of connections. And as you watch the camera slowly zoom out on my slightly uneven face, the light is hitting the retinas at the back of your eyes, provoking a cascade of electrical signals whizzing along those connections right through your brain, forming the image that you see in a fraction of a second. But how much do we really know about the relationship between mental health and our brains? And what happens when things go wrong? I'm a huge fan of neuroscience. It's a fascinating and important subject when trying to understand the ever-growing problem of mental health disorders. In this program, I'm going to find out what's happening at the frontier of neuroscience, getting right inside the physical brain and offering myself up as a test subject. I'll be exploring questions like, how effective are current treatments in mental health? What are the root causes of these disorders? And what does the future hold for our brains? It's also a subject that's close to my heart. My mother has been battling with mental health issues for most of her life. So where better to start than tea and cake with Mama Church?
What have you been diagnosed with, or what would your diagnosis of yourself be?
I used to call it manic depression, you know, or being a loony. It's now called, was it bipolar, or there's a lot of anxiety now, and that's been on and off for 31 years.
Yeah.
You know, I'm happy to talk about it because it's not talked about enough.
No.
And it is awful when you have a dark period. It's it can last for a day or two, or sometimes it can last for weeks. At times you're just very, very dark, down, and your glass is always half empty.
Yeah.
Always half empty. It's never been half full. And then you've got the other extreme of it where I can just go absolutely hyper.
Yeah.
You know, want to go on a spending spree and just overexcited, over happy. And then when you get a big downer from it, that's when, you know, I'll tend to drink far too much. And that's when usually, you know, the self-harming will usually happen. A lot of people are talking about mental illness now, no matter what form it takes. And they talk about self-harming, but only up to literally 20 years of age.
Yeah.
No one ever talks about anyone who's over 30.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'm not the only person out there
No,
who
probably
is still,
not.
you know.
What my mother is explaining is how many people experience day-to-day life. And it's been difficult growing up watching her suffer like this. In her darker periods, I felt quite powerless and unsure of how best to help her. I'm sure many of you watching have felt the same, with 1 in 4 people in Wales dealing with mental health problems. The one thing I could do was to try to understand. But understanding mental health means first getting to grips with the human brain. I've come to the largest brain bank in the UK at Imperial College London, where Professor Steve Gentleman has a way of showing me what physically happens in some neurological disorders by slicing up brains.
There you go.
Wow. It feels really, really strange to be holding a real person's brain. It feels quite weighty. Just feel very precious.
It does.
I sort of want to give it a cut in a really strange way.
This is the brain from somebody who's donated. They had no disease, as far as we know. So for looking at disease, we always need a comparator. We need to know what's normal. So these are very precious. On the other hand, this brain is from one of our donors who had Parkinson's disease while they were alive. So what I need to do here is to check by dissecting the brain that it was indeed Parkinson's disease. From the exterior, at the moment, there don't seem to be any major differences. Obviously, this one's a little bit larger, but there's no signs of overt pathology on either of these brains at the moment.
Well, let's crack on and have a look inside that brain.
Just need to loosen the tissue. So here is the midbrain. We describe as Mickey Mouse to the medical students so they can recognise it. And here we have the key area, which is the substantia nigra, which is very important for initiation of movement and is one of the areas of the brain that goes wrong in Parkinson's disease. This is perfectly normal, it's nice and black, and I would say that is a normal brain so far. So in a similar way, I'm going to dissect this brain from somebody we think had Parkinson's disease. So this is consistent with the clinical diagnosis because what we see is the black substance has disappeared. Those cells have all died. And that's what we think is the basis of the problems with movement that you see in Parkinson's disease patients.
Wow.
There's a quite clear difference between the black there and no black here.
Yeah. So we can quite clearly see the difference between a brain which doesn't have Parkinson's and a brain which does. So looking at the rest of it, are there any visual clues when it comes to other mental conditions like schizophrenia or depression?
So this is the problem with diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disease, depression. There are no changes in the brain that we can focus on. Perhaps if we're trying to come up with new approaches to treat these diseases, there's nothing tangible we can look at here in the brain at post-mortem to give us any idea on what we should be looking for.
Okay, so degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's can clearly be identified by looking at the brain. But mental health problems such as schizophrenia and depression have no clear signs. However, we do understand how different parts of the brain have different functions.
It is partially making me think of spam.
Spam. Spam. Oh, you're showing your age. Spam disappeared years ago. Thought I was bad. There you go. The brain in 30 easy pieces.
Wow.
What you're seeing around the outside is the cortex. That's what you could see when you saw the brain whole.
Yeah.
So what you have is what we call grey and white matter. So the grey matter is the outer ribbon there. That's all the nerve cell bodies. Underneath that is the white matter, and that's essentially the wiring of all those nerve cells. And the areas of the cortex at the front here are, if you like, the seat of the personality. That's what makes us human. Our frontal lobes are allowing us to make decisions, allowing us to interact with each other, keeping us in polite society, if you like.
I feel incredibly privileged to have witnessed this process. So how do you feel about it?
Well, it is a privilege, and these people have made this altruistic decision to try and help others by donating their brain. Would treat this brain tissue with exactly the same respect you would with a patient when they were alive.
Really?
It's still them. I know that the connection's difficult, but this is still a person.
And will you donate your brain?
Yes, you can have it. Not just yet, but yeah. Yes.
And therein lies the challenge for modern neuroscience. Physically investigating living human brains is generally frowned upon and, to be fair, illegal. And there's only so much we can learn from looking at the brain after death. This exquisite and mysterious organ keeps its secrets locked deep inside. But technology's beginning to change that.
This image is the most detailed scan of the internal wiring of the human brain that has ever been produced. And I think it's incredibly beautiful. And it was created right here in Cardiff.
This amazing map of the brain has been created at Cardiff University's New Brain Research Imaging Centre, or Kubrick for short. A team of researchers are using one of the most advanced scanners in the world to better understand the pathways of the brain and ultimately different mental health conditions such as depression. I've come here to find out more from research scientist Dr. Chantal Tax. So, Chantal, can you talk me through this beautiful image and what it means for our learning and understanding about the brain?
Yeah, so actually here you can see the roadmap of the brain. So which points are possibly connected to which points. So it's like an image of the wiring of the brain.
And what does it bring in that's new?
So before we could only inspect the wiring of the brain by actually taking a brain after death and cut it open to inspect it. But with this technique we can now finally look into a living brain, and we don't have to dissect it or anything.
Our brain cells are constantly talking to each other, sending messages along wire-like connections from one part to the other. These connections form and get stronger as we grow, develop, and experience new things. This is not an artist's impression. It's an actual scan of a real human brain, showing the connections inside it in a way never seen before. The incredibly detailed image was created with a special kind of MRI scanner, one of only 3 in the world, powerful enough to map the intricate connections between our brain cells.
We make a lot of different images from the same brain, and by combining all those images with a lot of mathematics and computer algorithms, we can compute back what the fiber structure might look like.
Why is it important to map it in the first place?
So a lot of research has focused on the functions of the brain, so which areas have which kind of functions. But it's really important actually to study the wiring. And more specifically, it's really important to study if that wiring is still intact, if there's actually information flowing through there.
And how could this technology be used to help treat mental health?
At this stage, we're really still trying to understand what's going on by studying large groups of people that have a certain disease versus healthy controls. So just to pinpoint which neuronal circuits are involved. Possibly in the future, it might become the case that we can get a new patient in and can give it a more specific diagnosis based on that knowledge that we gain now.
Whilst technology is allowing us to see the internal wiring of our brains, we're still a long way off understanding which wire does what, why it does it, and what the hell is actually going on in there. Which means we still rely on drugs that are decades old to treat mental health disorders. Has the medication worked? Because you have been on different medications and
Yes,
stuff.
I've been on them all. Citraplamol, no. Citraplamol, citrulline, Valium,
Citalopram.
Yeah, that's the one.
Do you know the way they work?
No.
My mum isn't alone in finding these tongue-tying drugs a bit mystifying. So how do they actually work? This is an SSRI, or to give it its proper name, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is a bit of a mouthful for such a tiny tablet. But this is what you'll most likely be prescribed if you go to the doctor showing signs of depression. And in Wales, a staggering 4 million of these are prescribed each year. Professor John Atack from Cardiff University is working to develop new drugs to treat psychiatric illnesses and has brought me down the arcades to explain how SSRIs work. A healthy brain contains the chemical serotonin, represented here by the pinballs. It is believed that serotonin plays an important role in regulating our moods and emotions. In a healthy brain, there is enough serotonin pinging around to keep a balanced mental state. But when the serotonin level drops too low, this can manifest in depression, anxiety, and other illnesses. SSRIs act like the paddles on the pinball machine, keeping what serotonin there is in the brain in play for longer, helping to maintain a healthy balance.
You've not played this before? You're rubbish, you are.
God, I know, it's dreadful. But SSRIs are far from perfect. Professor Atack is leading a team to discover better drugs that could help people living with mental health issues.
So, John, I've understood how SSRIs work, but in your opinion, do they actually work?
I think the answer to that would be yes and no. So certainly they work in some patients, but not necessarily all patients. And there are about a third of people that are treated with SSRIs and other antidepressant drugs that don't respond at all.
Considering that 1/3 of people who are on SSRIs, they're not actually working for them, do you think that is too high a number, that we should be re-looking at this? Because obviously SSRIs they're quite an old drug. These have been around for about 30 years, so it feels that we haven't progressed.
We lack a basic understanding of what's going on in the brains of people with depression. We think there's a reduction in the level of serotonin, so SSRIs then restore that serotonin level to normal. But what causes that? What part of the brain is involved? We don't understand those very important questions. Once we can understand what the mechanism is, we can then start to think about how we can have potentially cures to depression.
But developing new drugs isn't easy.
It's difficult, it's time-consuming, enormously expensive. But what drives people like myself and people involved in drug discovery for mental health is the fact that there's a huge medical need there. It's been estimated that the number of new drugs that are approved each year might be about 35. And that's over all different indications.
Really?
So that's cancer, immunology, so 35, and perhaps 2 or 3 of those might be neuroscience related. But the investment is of the order of $50 billion. So if you divide $50 billion by 35 drugs, it's that $1.5 billion per drug to get a drug onto the market.
Wow.
And a lot of that cost is the large number of projects that have to be started to get one over the finish line.
I see.
So as a drug company boss, I will invest my research money where I think I can get the best return. Unfortunately, at the moment, that's not psychiatry.
Sadly, I'm not surprised that funding for mental health research is such a low priority for the pharmaceutical industry. And with more and more scare stories in the media about the effectiveness of mainstream antidepressants, those like my mother can feel unsure about taking them.
So for a long time, you just didn't want to take antidepressants?
Yes.
Was that because of, did you feel ashamed? Did you feel like there was a stigma? Or was it just like, why did you decide not to take them, even though you were really struggling?
I just got that darkened down that I couldn't see it for myself.
You have been on all different sorts of SSRIs, but they didn't really work, did they?
No, and also I'm a great believer in, trying to help yourself. So for many years I didn't, deliberately not take anything.
So now you're on a much higher dosage
of citrulline, yes.
And how are you feeling?
Still having a couple of bad days, but generally, because I've been on it now for about, must be about 7 weeks, 8 weeks, I do feel it's helping, but I'm also aware of myself.
Yeah.
As well, and accepting my limitations.
Yeah.
As well, that I'm not going to be perfect overnight.
Now, I think it would be fair to expect that any drug we already know about has been at least trialled to treat psychiatric disorders. But naturally occurring drugs that have historically been seen as taboo may have been overlooked.
Inside here is a psychedelic compound called psilocybin. Now, could this chemical be the key to unlocking new treatments for severe depression?
Currently, there are controversial trials taking place in Imperial College London, and Professor David Nutt is the man behind the shroom.
So, David, can you explain to me exactly what psilocybin is?
So psilocybin is a chemical. It's produced by a particular species of mushroom that when you take it, actually breaks down to another substance called psilocin. And psilocin is a kind of mimic of serotonin. And when psilocybin gets in the brain, it stimulates much more powerfully and produces this kind of hallucinogenic psychedelic experience.
The commonly called magic mushroom is a Class A drug in the UK, and it is illegal to possess them. It took Professor Nutt and his team almost 3 years to get permission to run the trial, using a small dose of chemically extracted psilocybin. For the trial, patients were given the psilocybin in a specially prepared hospital room with music playing, and supported throughout the experience by 2 psychiatrists.
We recruited 20 people. They had what's called treatment-resistant depression. Our definition was they'd failed on at least 2 antidepressants, and actually one person had failed on 9.
Wow.
And they'd all had CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, and that had not worked.
Okay.
So they were relatively ill people who'd often had illness for 5 to 10 years. We brought them into our hospital setting at the Hammersmith in London. We gave them the 25 milligram dose. And remarkably, even after a single day, a lot of them were a lot better. And over weeks, we found that the peak benefit emerged at about 4 to 5 weeks.
Wow. And then was that with no secondary dose, or?
No, that was it. And we didn't allow them to have any other treatment for 3 months. Some of them got completely recovered. About a third were completely recovered. They meet the criteria for remission. They no longer have depression. And some of them have stayed completely recovered. The majority haven't, though. The majority, over time, over a few months, have gradually, the depression's come back. And that says to me that if, as I hope we will, we roll this out as a treatment in the real world, we're probably going to be looking at perhaps treating people once or twice a year in order to keep maintaining the benefits.
More research is needed to fully understand what is going on in the brain under the influence of psilocybin. But Professor David Nutt and his team have a mind-expanding theory.
So what we have here are the brain imaging of people under placebo, in a normal state, and under psilocybin, the psychedelic, okay? On the left-hand side, you see almost all the connections are around the edge. And that's because over our lifetime, our brain gets trained to do things very efficiently in a very localized way.
Yeah, so this is sort of like routine behaviours.
The brain is repetitively locked into doing the same thing very efficiently. So under psilocybin, the brain can make connections which it hasn't been allowed to make since childhood. And we believe that breaking down those traditional connections and allowing new connections to form is why people overcome their depression. Because depression is a way of thinking that gets very deeply embedded.
Yeah, very ingrained.
Ingrained, absolutely. People ruminate and they think the same negative thoughts all the time. And every time you have a thought, it gets more ingrained. And by disrupting those thought processes, we can allow people to escape from it.
The results of these clinical trials have shown that the chemically extracted psilocybin had a positive effect in the very small group of people tested. Though it's worth remembering that these tests were conducted under strict laboratory conditions and is certainly not something anyone should try at home.
It would be very sad if someone was to have a bad experience and come to harm because they were self-medicating. So I strongly recommend people don't do that.
Yeah.
We think it's probably a combination of the fact that people are being given a psychedelic experience in a very contained, supportive setting.
Yeah.
So you've got psychotherapy and pharmacology coming together, and that's probably why it's so profound.
This was a trial of a handful of people, and I've already heard how hard it is to get a new drug to market. Trials can involve thousands of people being used as human guinea pigs, and that's not always possible or ethical. But there might be a method of testing on living human brain tissue without the living human.
So I'm on my way to Cambridge to meet a young scientist called Madeleine Lancaster, and she has figured out a way to grow human brain tissue outside of the body. She calls them cerebral organoids, or sometimes mini brains.
Madeleine leads a research group that is using these mini brains to better understand brain development, which could have far-reaching consequences in mental health research.
this is where the brains are kept.
That's right, yeah. So here we have
they're moving.
all of our small cerebral organoids, yeah. So you can see they're rotating because that is trying to mimic the blood flow.
Okay.
Allow the fluid that they're in to bathe them and even, get into the inside of the organoids and keep them alive. So here's a couple of brain organoids, and you can see they're pretty large.
They're quite big.
Yeah, so these ones are pretty old actually. So they're around 5 months old.
Okay.
Since we started.
And that's a good age to get to.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much as big as they get.
Okay.
So these are some of the biggest we have. Basically, what we find is that they model the first trimester of brain development really well. After conception, you start making an embryo, and part of that embryo is going to be the brain. And then around about the time that you would transition from first trimester to second trimester, that's about when things start to sort of diverge from actual human brain development.
This sounds like the stuff of science fiction, but the real science behind mini brains is amazing. Madeline and her team can take almost any cell from the body, like a skin cell, say, and reprogram it to become a stem cell. In other words, a blank slate. She then uses a unique recipe of sugars, proteins, vitamins and minerals to coax these cells to become brain cells, which she then uses to grow her mini brains.
The way that I view my role in this whole process is as a gardener. If you were going to plant a plant, you would plant a seed and you would give it soil, fertilizer, water, sunlight, and then the seed would develop on its own and make a plant. In our case, the soil and water and sunlight, that's basically the protein, the sugars, the minerals within this fluid.
They may look like white blobs, but when you look at these mini brains under a microscope, they really come to life. They grow to contain around 500,000 brain cells, which group together to look like parts of the developing human brain. Incredibly, the brain cells can even form connections with each other.
So can you imagine a time where we could grow a complete human brain?
I think no, and I don't think we need to, because the questions that we're interested in, we can model on a smaller scale with these little mini brains. For ethical reasons, I don't think we would want to, honestly.
Yeah. And why grow human neurons? Why is it important?
So we've got 86 billion neurons in our brain, and that is a lot more than all the animal species that we typically tend to try to study to try to understand brain development. So, we're talking about, like 100-fold more than a mouse brain, for example. If you want to try to understand human brain development, and particularly the human-specific features of that, then, of course, an animal model won't really give us that information. Because we have them in a dish, we can put anything that we want on these tissues, and we can see what drugs might affect whatever feature we see as abnormal in, let's say, a schizophrenia mini brain organoid, or an organoid developed from a patient with autism or with Alzheimer's disease.
This is so out there, but it feels like it could be revolutionary in how we go about treating a variety of mental health conditions. And whilst I could spend hours nerding out over Madeline's work, it's all gone a bit future. So back to the present and the realities of living with a malfunctioning mind. Now, the best treatment we have for a whole range of mental health disorders is a combination of medication and counselling. But it's not right for everyone.
What about talking therapies and things? You've had bits and bobs before, haven't you?
Yes.
But you didn't like it?
And I didn't think it did me any good, no. And I thought it was a load of... I won't swear anymore. Loads of rubbish.
But I think maybe that, again, was to do with your state of mind. Because you came back saying, I don't know what was going on, what was the point of that? I had to do all the talking. I was like, yeah, of course you did. Yeah. They're not going to just talk at you.
Yeah.
As the therapist, this is how you become better.
You can't expect someone to, to help you there and then, overnight.
No.
But it was just so cliched, with...
Yeah.
Oh, but you feel like this, that one, you feel like that, and it's like, I just wanted to scream.
Whilst my mother's own review of talking therapies is less than glowing, they certainly have helped a great many others. Could this have something to do with the nature of the illness being treated? What about those whose troubles do stem from a specific time and place? Could their focus on certain traumatic memories make talking to professionals more helpful? One person who has been slowly benefiting from talking therapies is retired British Army Lieutenant Colonel John Skipper.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Come in. Mind Harry.
Oh, lovely doggy. Hello, Harry. His distinguished military career left him suffering with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. John was leading a large unit sent to gather intelligence about the war in Bosnia and witness the atrocities as they unfolded.
Bosnia was a bit of a turning point for me in '94. And there were some pretty graphic and some horrid scenes that I witnessed there. The Bosnian Serb army were intent on reducing a number of enclaves to the east of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And it looked like a road crash. If you can imagine, you're in a dream and you're watching a road and you know there's an accident going to happen, a young child is going to be run down, but you can't move, you can't do anything about it. That's what it was like. We were watching young boys and men being herded into buses and separated from women. And over a week, sorry about that.
It's all right. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, carry on. But over a week, what we were seeing was, and we were reporting it, there's going to be genocide committed. And what we were seeing was very clearly, and I was an intelligence officer, we've got to stop this. And we couldn't. We couldn't stop it. And we knew it was happening. And we saw it happening from a distance. And it's quite hard to bear. I think that PTSD, I didn't know I had it or was developing it at the time, but there was a trauma laid out in front of me, and I could feel it changing me. Something was happening. There's defense mechanisms happening inside you. I remember being described throughout the army as Mr. Unflappable, Mr. Laid Back, Mr. Happy. I became very intolerant, but I didn't know it. I became very angry, but didn't know it. As it gets to a point where you're so low, where taking your life is an easy step. That's quite difficult to say right now. I've become used to it because it happened to me. Because I was in the military, treatment, which was cognitive behavioural therapy, started within a couple of weeks. And I had 38 two-hour sessions.
Wow.
So my psychotherapist told me.
Yeah.
Over 2 years.
Brilliant.
And I'm glad I didn't have to pay for them.
Yes.
But it saved my life.
Now John is helping with a groundbreaking new treatment for PTSD, currently being trialled at the University Hospital of Wales.
Oh, it's like climbing a mountain, isn't it?
If you walk forward for me, please. Yeah, and then backwards towards me.
For the treatment, called 3MDR, patients walk on a treadmill whilst being shown images related to their trauma. The current trial focuses on war veterans, and I've come here to meet Dr. Neil Kitchener to find out more.
So Neil, what is going on inside the head of people with PTSD?
We think what happens is the memory gets stored in the wrong part of the brain and gets triggered by matching triggers. So for a military veteran, it might be a car backfiring. It sounds like gunfire, and the guy hits the deck because he thinks he's under attack again. And the amygdala, which is the very primitive part of the brain that keeps us safe, helps us move out of the way of danger, so fight and flight response, has this radar effect of being too sensitive.
Okay.
So there's threat everywhere.
What exactly is 3MDR?
3MDR stands for Motion-Assisted Multi-Modular Memory Desensitization Reconsolidation Therapy.
Wow! And what does that actually mean in sort of layman's terms?
It's masses of exposure. So we're asking the patient to bring images and music of their trauma, and whilst they're on the treadmill, they're walking back into their traumatic memory. Whereas most of the time, patients with PTSD want to run the other way, not talk about it, avoid it, and they box it off and leave it there.
The physical process of walking towards the images must be challenging, but empowering. John is literally facing his trauma head-on. He is then asked to describe how he is feeling in the moment.
I was hyper alert, I was anxious.
Yep.
His words are projected onto the screen to help strengthen the memories.
Happy to be out on the ground with a team because you train for this. 96, 72, 93.
John is then asked to shout out numbers seen on a moving red ball.
99, 51, 99.
By being distracted from the image, this enables him to disengage and let it go. Now he is mentally prepared for the next image. The theory is that this technique allows John to store traumatic memories in the correct part of his brain, in the past, where they belong.
What, no distress, 10 extremely? How distressing right now?
4 to 5.
Okay, good. I'll give you an analogy with a linen cupboard. So if you imagine that someone's had a traumatic event and they've got lots of memories and thoughts and feelings and smells, and they don't want to go there because it triggers off flashbacks, nightmares or intrusive images, they just shove it away in this linen cupboard and shut the door. But what happens is bonfire night, fireworks go off, explosions, and veterans, their cupboard doors spring open and they're starting to relive their traumatic event.
And all of this messy linen, where none of which is organised properly, all just comes...
Falls on the floor.
And then do they repeatedly just keep chucking it back in?
Yeah. So they just chuck it back in and shut the door again.
Without sorting through.
And exactly, so it's never sorted, so they never realise that it's finished, that the event's in the past.
I see.
So this therapy and other trauma-focused therapies take out that memory, examine it in great detail, fold it up neatly and just put it back where it should be.
So that then it's stored in the right place, which is in the past.
And they can go back to it when they want to, but not when they don't want to.
So how was that for you, John?
That was tiring.
Yeah?
Physically, mentally.
Yeah.
By golly.
How does it feel within your physical self?
Well, it is pure emotion. It's like running a race. It's getting towards the end of a race where you can either win or lose, and that you find something else. And there is something else that you find in this. I wish I'd had this years ago. This is what combating a traumatic memory is all about.
So far, we have exclusively looked at the brain in relation to mental health. But there is one area of study that is looking at another part of the body entirely. Our guts are home to trillions of bacteria, which sounds a bit gross, to be honest, but actually it's now thought that the bacteria in our guts and what we eat are probably affecting our mental health. Food for thought. Our bodies are home to colonies of microscopic organisms like bacteria and fungi. They're called microbiota, and together they form the microbiome. This is unique to each of us, like a bacterial fingerprint. I've come to St. Mark's Hospital in London to meet Dr. Aisha Akbar to find out how influential these bacteria can be and to what extent they may be influencing our mental health. Dr. Akbar, my journey here has led me through many different scientists, doctors, mostly related to the brain and how the brain's working, but you are a consultant gastroenterologist, which is to do with the stomach. How on earth do we get the stomach to the brain?
There are trillions of bacteria in the gut. If you take the bacteria out of the gut, they weigh 1 to 2 kilograms, as much as the human brain itself. The microbiota is now being thought to be implicated in many disease areas, for example, obesity, mental health, irritable bowel syndrome, inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes.
So how do we pick up these bacteria?
When we're born, as we pass through the birth canal, that's when we get the majority of our bacteria, and our guts are colonised with these bacteria that then formulate part of our normal, healthy immune system, if you like. It's then influenced through breast milk and onwards through our diet, what we eat, through antibiotics, through stress. All of these have an impact on our microbiota, and it evolves and changes as we grow.
What happens when we have an unhealthy microbiome? Can we treat it? Here at St. Mark's Hospital, they're carrying out a radical treatment called a fecal microbiota transplant, or in other words, poo from a healthy donor is transplanted into the colon of an individual with an illness. Sounds messy. So, Dr. Akbar, there is no delicate way to put this. This is some liquid poo.
That's our fecal transplant, Charlotte.
I see. And so, do explain to me what is happening in our fecal transplant.
So we've taken our donor sample, liquidized it in the lab, and gets it down to very small particles so we can actually deliver it down the colonoscope. Here's our colonoscope. which we're going to be using when we deliver our fecal transplant.
Oh, that poor person.
A nice long tube, because the colon is about 1 metre long, so we've got a long tube to get there.
Oh my gosh.
Once we've got to the end, we deliver it through our channel in the scope with a syringe down the scope, right in the right place where we want it, and that allows the poo sample to be delivered uniformly across the majority of the large bowel.
What purpose will it serve to inject essentially what is somebody else's poo into another person?
So what we're hoping is that we're going to take a healthy microbiome and transplant that, so in essence give the individual a healthy microbiome to mix with their existing microbiome and hence positively influence that, is the theory behind it.
Dr. Akbar has arranged for me to watch a procedure via a video link, which means you get to watch it too.
You can see here the large bowel, the colon, and we have the opening of the appendix right in the middle of the bowel. So that's a nice picture showing us we're at the end. We inject the stool transplant down the scope. And why is it not rejected? Because the body's used to having poo there. It's used to having lots of bacteria there.
Okay.
And obviously, if we started rejecting all the bacteria, it would cause lots of inflammation and problems within the large intestine.
Yeah.
So that's the best site actually to think about delivering this transplant without having ill effects.
The big buzz currently in science is that our microbiome is also having an impact on our mental health.
So microbiome has been linked in various studies to lots of mental health disorders, all the way from autism, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression, so big range of mental disorders.
That's quite comprehensive.
Absolutely, even things like post-traumatic stress disorder. So you can see how the microbiota may well be key in the future to treating a lot of these disorders.
What is the current thinking on how the microbiome is directly affecting mental health?
So at the moment it's all hypothetical, but we believe that the microbiome produces lots of neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are chemicals that basically can affect the brain. And one of the ways that it gets all the way up to the brain, potentially through the nervous system, is the vagus nerve, a big nerve that connects the brain down to the guts.
And so if there were people at home who were trying always to improve their mental health, what should they be doing, eating and avoiding?
So prebiotics are foods that the probiotics eat. So we can use a diet rich in prebiotics. Certain foods like bananas, raw onions, garlic, Jerusalem artichoke are all rich prebiotic foods. So we can use natural foods to influence our probiotics. Obviously, if we can, avoiding too many antibiotics. The other thing that we know probably has a negative effect are foods high in emulsifiers, lots of the processed food. So the more natural foods, richer in fibre, are probably better for the microbiota as a whole.
So natural grown food where possible.
I know. The concept that your guts could influence your mental health is difficult to get your head around. But somehow, even harder to imagine is the idea that some of us may already have it within us to succumb to mental illness. What if my mother has already passed down certain genes? Do we even have control over our own mental well-being? Or is it written in our code?
Why do you think people get depressed?
It's not something I've really ever thought about. I've never ever really thought, is it genetic? Is it a chemical imbalance? And if so, where does that come from? What starts that off? Is there an incident in your life? Or has it just always been there underlying and, you know, if it is
fated.
genetic, yeah.
Research is being carried out at the National Centre for Mental Health in Cardiff to try and answer some of these questions. DNA samples are being collected from volunteers in order to try and identify the genes that could be responsible for certain mental health conditions. The leader of this research is Professor Ian Jones.
So Ian, a couple of months ago, I was a staunch believer in the fact that nothing could affect your mental health apart from emotional well-being and environmental factors, and that it pretty much wouldn't have had anything to do with your parents or genes that were passed down. But here you are discovering something different.
It's really important to emphasise right up front that I wouldn't disagree is that actually the things that happen to us in our lives are really important in our mental health. What we also know is that genetic factors play a role, that these are illnesses that can run in families. What has changed is that science enables us now to try and identify what those individual genetic variations are that increase or decrease risk for an individual. So it's an exciting time.
So Ian, what are you doing in this study?
So the National Centre for Mental Health study is asking for the help of people with a range of mental health conditions. We're asking for people to give us information, to fill out questionnaires, but also to give us a blood sample so that we can look at the genetic factors that we know to be important. We're trying to piece all that complex jigsaw together, get the information that we need to really understand what it is that causes these conditions. This isn't going to be solved just by getting the help of a few people, even a few hundred people. What we need is many thousands, many tens of thousands of people who join with us to try and solve this.
To get a better understanding of how this all works, I'm volunteering to take part myself. First, psychology assistant Larry O'Donovan has to take me through a difficult but necessarily thorough questionnaire.
So the next section now is just asking a little bit about family psychiatric history. So anyone in the family that you're aware of who has received a diagnosis?
Yes, my mother, she has been diagnosed with depression, bipolar, and she's a self-harmer.
It doesn't get any easier with the needly bit either.
Okay. There we go, got it.
Wonderful.
A bit of pressure on there for me. Thank you.
Now to get the DNA extracted from my blood, with the help of research technician Dr. Alexandra Evans. But first, I need to be suitably dressed.
It's not going to work.
Come on, Charles, you can do it.
Wonderful. You can see I'm not used to putting on gloves very often. Okay, all ready. So, I've got your blood.
The team here are gathering thousands of DNA samples from people diagnosed with mental health conditions, but they also need samples from people without mental health conditions to act as a comparator.
The first bit of the procedure is to get rid of the red blood cells. Red blood cells don't contain any DNA. It's the white blood cells that we're after.
And wouldn't you know, extracting DNA is not very easy.
So this solution will burst open the red blood cells without affecting the white blood cells.
So first of all, my red blood cells need to be separated from my white blood cells. And that's done in the medical equivalent of a giant washing machine on a superfast spin cycle.
We've got our white blood cell pellets here, but we still need to get the DNA out. The white blood cells are that much tougher than red blood cells, so we need to use detergent to break them open.
I'm intrigued to see how this DNA extraction malarkey works, seeing as it's what makes us who we are. What's it even going to look like?
So the last step before we see the DNA is to add in ethanol, alcohol. It'll create an environment that the DNA doesn't like, and it will just drop out of solution.
So DNA doesn't enjoy the booze?
No.
And will literally fall out of the booze?
Absolutely.
Because it doesn't like it? Great.
This is your one.
Okay.
Okay. So can you see that cloud has just formed there? And I haven't even mixed it yet.
I can.
You can see there's lots of trapped air bubbles in there, trapped in amongst the DNA. There you go. There's your cloud of DNA. So yeah, good yield.
It's really sort of wispy and ethereal.
Got nice clean DNA there.
So that is essentially me in a test tube. I didn't realise I was quite so phlegmy. So this feels deeply odd, staring at my own DNA, but in a way it sort of feels really narcissistic as well. Like I just want to keep looking at it. What is me in the test tube? So essentially, I feel like it's the ultimate selfie, darling.
All the samples in the study are given anonymously, so I won't find out the results of my DNA. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I'd want to anyway. However, my sample and questionnaire will join the tens of thousands of other samples as part of this study. Already, the team in Cardiff have started to identify specific genes that play a part in a range of mental health conditions, from bipolar disorder to schizophrenia. This provides a better understanding of these disorders and will hopefully lead to better treatments.
This graph summarises the results of over 60,000 people with schizophrenia who've taken part in the work. The team here have identified more than 200 individual genes now that are involved in increasing risk.
I mean, is it essentially a sort of age-old argument about nature-nurture?
Yeah, and I think the nature-nurture debate is old-fashioned. I think it misses the point.
Okay,
yeah.
explain to me how.
It assumes that it's either going to be one thing or the other, whereas actually everything that we know, the research that's been done tells us it's going to be a bit of both and a complex mixture of both at that.
It's no easy feat working out what happens in the brain when people start feeling the debilitating and sometimes inescapable effects of mental illness. It's even harder to know how to treat it. I'm starting to see how modern neuroscience is continuously breaking ground in all directions. But the modern world is also throwing up new concerns for our mental health.
Like most of us, I have a real love-hate relationship with my phone. Whilst I think it is a tool of incredible power, especially in terms of education, I can ask any question in the whole history of human knowledge, and I'll pretty much be able to find out about it on my phone. Now, that's an amazing thing, a really positive change to have to our human society. But also with that comes endless marketing, Twitter, Facebook, 24-hour news, this constant scrolling of often really negative and quite empty things. The amount of times I have spent days sucked into the vortex of Twitter arguments or, empty scrolling of Facebook. So it definitely is a love-hate relationship.
Social media may make us more connected to one another, but it is potentially addictive and isolating, and could be causing many more of us to suffer from mental health disorders. I've come to Swansea University to meet Phil Reid, a professor of psychology and expert in the growing field of digital addiction. I'm about to take part in a trial to discover if I'm an addict myself.
If you talk me through exactly what's going to happen.
What we're going to try and do is to see what your relationship is to the web. And we're going to try and see that through looking at your physiological responses.
Okay.
And the little device which is on your hand is going to be monitoring your blood flow and your heart rate and your skin conductance.
Okay.
All of which will tell you if you're interested in what you're seeing or not.
I know that spending time online can have a physical and emotional effect on us, but Professor Reid has devised a simple experiment that can scientifically prove it.
So whenever you're ready, you can just hit the enter key and the experiment will start.
Okay. Lovely. Delightful.
For 20 minutes, I am shown a series of pictures, mostly of plants, but there are also some internet-related images amongst them.
The web is really set up like a hugely addictive drug. If you feel a little bit internet addicted, the first time you turn your web on, or the first time you turn your mobile device on, that gives you a huge positive rush.
I'm not gonna lie, I feel pretty exposed at this juncture. It's a bit like somebody poking round your internet history. I mean, I think I've got control over it, but am I addicted to the internet?
Okay, Charlotte, I think we have enough data now to have a look at what your responses are, so you can start to relax.
Okay, thanks. So, Phil, how's it gone? Am I a digital addict?
Well, you've got some signs of being really rather interested in it.
Okay.
So these spikes here are when you're getting stressed. And we've matched those up with the pictures. But the really big peaks, they correspond to when we've shown you pictures of anything internet related. So those are beginning to pique your interest and you're beginning to look a little bit anxious and stressed at that level.
What does that mean?
Well, Long term, if you keep that up, that stress reaction is going to trigger a hormone called cortisol. And we know that cortisol affects various areas of the brain. It swells the amygdala, and that's exactly what happens in people who are depressed. So it's perhaps not surprising that internet addiction correlates very strongly with depression. But it also will shrink the hippocampus, which is involved in memory. And the other area it really affects is the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher functions, so planning, inhibition of responses. And we do know again that people who use the internet heavily find it harder to plan, they're less motivated to study, and they also find it harder to inhibit their responses, and we've shown that a number of times.
What is quantified as a lot of internet usage, like a heavy user who may have a problem? I mean, these are such drug terms as well, aren't they?
They
a heavy
are.
user who may have a problem as opposed to someone who will use it quite regularly but healthily.
It's not a problem till it's a problem, but when it starts interfering with the rest of your life, it is.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as just saying it's this much usage.
Yeah.
That gives you a problem. It's how it affects you and how you feel when you're not using it.
Yeah. Where do you think this is going, especially for young people?
The internet is beginning to almost age people's cognitive function.
Wow.
So you're getting the same type of effects in youngsters as we usually would see in seniors. We don't really know why that's the case, whether it's a psychological effect or whether it's something physiological. I think we have to educate people that this is a tool. They should be the master of it and not it driving their behaviour, which I think we're beginning to see.
I think I'm going to take a leaf out of your book, Phil, before it gets any worse.
I would do that. Don't let that thing into your life.
No, I know.
It seems to me that just as we are starting to get to grips with our own psychologies, a technological phenomenon, mostly in the form of social media usage, may be rapidly altering the way we use our brains. Whether this is good or bad remains to be seen, and maybe it's too early in the technology's development to say for sure. What we do know is that digital communication cannot replicate the rewarding effect that real-world human-to-human socialising has upon our brains.
So it might be an idea to occasionally unplug and let the brain do what it's meant to do, which is experience the sensory world in all its wonder.
My incredibly graceful dancing aside, what I've learned is there's so much we don't know yet about the brain. And it's so complex, maybe we will never fully understand it. On this journey, there have been a lot of answers, but perhaps even more questions. The pioneers in mental health research are laying the groundwork for a future where people like my mother won't have to suffer. And one final thing. I honestly think we should get off our phones more often. And never underestimate the power of a lovely chat and a good cwtch.